At 10:19 in the morning of June 19, 1944, radar operators aboard ships of Task Force 58 detected the first Japanese carrier strike wave approaching from the west at a range of approximately 150 miles. Fighter Direction Officer Lieutenant Commander Joseph Eggert, stationed aboard the USS Lexington, began vectoring American Hellcat fighters to intercept. The Japanese strike formation never reached the American carrier fleet. 3 more Japanese carrier strike waves followed over the next 6 hours. Of the approximately 430 carrier aircraft Japan launched that morning, 395 were shot down, crashed, or never returned to their carriers. Land-based Japanese aircraft attempting to operate from Guam added 50 more to the total losses. Japan launched 480 aircraft on the day it committed its entire carrier force to stop the American fleet at the Marianas. 35 operational aircraft came back. A pilot named Ziggy Neff, climbing out of his cockpit at the end of the day's flying, found the English language for what had just happened. He called it a turkey shoot. The phrase was immediate and exactly right. 480 aircraft destroyed, 6 hours of combat. 29 American aircraft lost to enemy action. 395 Japanese carrier aircraft destroyed or lost. 35 operational carrier aircraft surviving. The largest carrier air battle in the history of aerial warfare had ended before dinner on June 19, 1944. If this story matters to you, subscribe to the channel. Just subscribe. That is all. Thank you. Japan had entered the Pacific War with the most skilled and experienced naval aviators in the world. The men who had flown from the Kido Butai against Pearl Harbor in December of 1941 had accumulated hundreds of hours of carrier-specific flight training. The pilots who executed the Pearl Harbor attack had been selected, trained, and refined over years through a system that prioritized quality over quantity, producing small numbers of exceptional aviators rather than large numbers of adequately trained ones. This approach produced what were arguably the finest naval airmen of the first half of the 20th century. It also produced a training pipeline that could not replace significant losses at scale. At the Battle of Midway in June of 1942, Japan lost approximately 110 carrier pilots killed. The individual pilots lost at Midway had been, in many cases, the irreplaceable product of years of rigorous and specialized training. Japan's training system could produce their technical successors in terms of basic flying skills, but not in time, and not with the accumulated combat experience that had made the Midway pilots what they were. At Coral Sea, at the Eastern Solomons, at Santa Cruz Islands, more experienced carrier pilots died. Each loss removed from the active pilot pool someone who could not be replaced at equivalent capability level by the accelerated training programs Japan implemented after each major operational defeat. By June of 1944, the pilots flying Japan's carrier aircraft were, in many cases, the successors to the successors of the men who had attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941. They had significantly fewer total flight training hours. For many of them, the Battle of the Philippine Sea would be their first carrier combat engagement of the war. Available records from the period indicate that many of the replacement pilots had fewer than 500 hours of total flight time, compared to the roughly 800 to 1,000 hours that had characterized many of the men of the Pearl Harbor strike force. They were not inadequately trained by peacetime standards. They were inadequately trained by the specific standard of what they were about to be sent into. The aircraft they flew had also been superseded. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero had been among the finest carrier fighter aircraft in the world when the Pacific War began in December of 1941. It was faster than any American carrier fighter then in commission in December of 1941. It was significantly more maneuverable than any American carrier fighter at low and medium combat altitudes. It had a combat range that no American carrier fighter of the period could match. These combined technical advantages made it the dominant carrier fighter aircraft through the Pacific War's first 6 months of combat. By June of 1944, the Zero had been thoroughly outclassed by the aircraft that had replaced it as the primary American carrier fighter. The Grumman F6F Hellcat had been specifically designed and built to defeat the Zero in carrier combat. It was significantly faster in a diving attack. It could sustain considerably higher speeds in level flight. It climbed faster than the Zero at altitudes above 15,000 feet. Its radial air-cooled engine was better protected and harder to set on fire than the Zero's design. It carried 6 50-caliber machine guns in the wings. It could absorb battle damage that would have destroyed a Zero and still return to the carrier. A skilled and experienced Zero pilot could defeat a Hellcat in a sustained low-altitude turning engagement. A Hellcat pilot who did not allow that specific engagement to develop had a decisive advantage in almost every other combat scenario. Task Force 58 went into the Battle of the Philippine Sea with the additional advantage of 2 technological systems that the Japanese had not previously encountered in combination. The first was the radio proximity fuse, designated the VT fuse, which allowed anti-aircraft shells to detonate when they passed near an aircraft rather than requiring a direct hit. Standard anti-aircraft fire required a fuse set to detonate at a specific predetermined altitude, and the probability of actually hitting a maneuvering aircraft at that altitude was low. The VT fuse raised the effective lethality of every anti-aircraft round fired at a formation, because it detonated within lethal fragmentation distance of aircraft that the shell did not directly strike. The Japanese pilots who flew through the anti-aircraft fire of Task Force 58 on June 19th encountered a defensive environment substantially more lethal than anything they or their operational commanders had anticipated. The second system was radar-directed fighter control. Eggert and the other fighter direction officers aboard Task Force 58's ships used air search radar to detect incoming Japanese formations at ranges far beyond visual contact. They vectored American Hellcats to intercepts that positioned them above and behind the Japanese aircraft before the Japanese pilots could see the Americans coming. A conventional fighter interception in 1944 depended on visual contact, and the aircraft that saw the other first had a significant tactical advantage. The radar-directed FDO system gave the American fighters the equivalent of seeing first at ranges of over 100 miles. When Eggert detected the first Japanese raid at 10:19 in the morning and began vectoring the Hellcats, the Japanese pilots in those formations did not know they were being tracked. Operation A-Go was Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's operational plan for the decisive naval engagement that Japanese naval doctrine had been building toward since the beginning of the Pacific War. The plan rested on 2 critical premises. The first was that Japanese carrier aircraft had a significantly longer combat radius than American carrier aircraft, allowing Ozawa to attack from ranges at which American aircraft could not respond by attacking his carriers. The second was that land-based aircraft from the Marianas airfields would operate in coordination with his carrier aircraft, supplementing his carrier air groups and giving Japan a significant force multiplier that the Americans could not counter. Both of those premises had been invalidated before the battle began. Admiral Spruance had authorized preliminary carrier strikes against the Marianas airfields beginning on June 11th. American carrier aircraft struck the airfields on Saipan, Tinian, Rota, and Guam. By June 15th, when American troops began landing on Saipan, the land-based Japanese air power in the Marianas had been substantially destroyed. The aircraft that Ozawa's plan had depended on to supplement his carrier air groups were gone before the battle started. Ozawa did not know this. His intelligence assessments had not accurately reported the scale of damage from the American pre-battle strikes. He therefore launched his 4 strike waves on June 19th under the assumption that substantial land-based aircraft were available to coordinate with his carrier strikes. They were not. The first Japanese strike wave of the day, designated Raid 1, consisted of approximately 69 carrier aircraft. It was detected by Eggert's radar at 10:19. The Hellcats were vectored to intercept at an altitude advantage, positioned above the Japanese formation and ready for diving attacks. The Japanese pilots flew into the interception without the radar warning systems that would have allowed them to see the Americans coming. Approximately 25 of the 69 aircraft in Raid 1 were destroyed before the formation reached the vicinity of the American fleet. The surviving aircraft dropped their bombs from too high an altitude while under continuing attack from pursuing Hellcats and scored no significant hits. Most of those remaining aircraft were then shot down as they attempted to disengage and return. The second wave, designated Raid 2, was the largest of the 4 strike waves. with approximately 128 aircraft. This was the wave that produced the combats most associated with the day's result. Lieutenant Alexander Vratiu of Fighter Squadron 16, flying his F6F from the USS Lexington, intercepted a formation of Japanese dive bombers during the Raid 2 engagement. In approximately 8 minutes of engagement, he shot down 6 of them. Vratiu was not exceptional in the context of June 19th. He was representative of what hundreds of American pilots were doing across the entire battle. Hundreds of pilots across all of Task Force 58 were having comparable individual engagements simultaneously across the same broad airspace. The formation integrity of Raid 2 collapsed under the simultaneous and compounding pressure of Hellcat attacks from above and intense anti-aircraft fire from the ships of the fleet below. If this story matters to you, subscribe to the channel. Just subscribe, that is all. Thank you. Raid 3, consisting of approximately 47 aircraft, reached closer to the American fleet than any other wave but still failed to inflict significant combat damage. 7 aircraft from Raid 3 successfully pressed their attacks and damaged the battleship USS South Dakota, which was hit by 1 bomb. The South Dakota was not sunk or seriously disabled. The rest of Raid 3 was destroyed before any remaining aircraft could press their attacks to effective bombing range. Raid 4, approximately 82 aircraft, was diverted by navigational error or by plan toward Guam, where the aircraft attempted to land and refuel before continuing toward the American fleet. American Hellcats intercepted the Raid 4 formation at Guam and attacked the Japanese aircraft as they slowed for landing approach. Aircraft that had survived the earlier interception over the fleet were destroyed on their approach to the one Guam airfield that was supposed to have been available to receive them. By the time all 4 strike waves had been accounted for, the arithmetic was definitive. Of the 430 carrier aircraft Ozawa launched, 395 had been shot down, crashed, or were so badly damaged they could not be recovered. Japan had 35 operational carrier aircraft remaining from the full force that had launched from its carriers that morning. Ozawa did not immediately understand the full scale of the destruction. Communications between the strike aircraft and the carrier fleet had been fragmentary throughout the day's fighting. He believed that many of his pilots, unable to return to the carriers given the engagement distances involved, had diverted to and landed at Guam airfields, as the operational plan's alternative routing specified. He maintained his fleet's position in the Philippine Sea through the entire evening of June 19th. That evening, as Task Force 58's pilots returned from their final missions, Ziggy Neff climbed out of his Hellcat's cockpit and stood on the flight deck. He was far from alone. The air groups of Task Force 58 were returning from the day's engagements, reporting their individual scores, and the pilots were assembling on the carrier flight decks in the particular elevated exhaustion that follows hours of intense combat flight. Neff said what the day had felt like to the pilots who had flown it. He said it had been just like an old-fashioned turkey shoot. The phrase moved through the flight decks of Task Force 58 that June evening faster than any official dispatch. By the following morning it had become the permanent name of the day's action. American pilots had named it themselves. Their name for it would prove to be the most precise description available. The photograph of Vratiu on the Lexington's flight deck has become one of the most widely reproduced images of Pacific War air combat. He is holding up 6 fingers and grinning broadly for the camera on the deck of the Lexington. The image captures something the official battle reports do not. The pilots who flew the Turkey Shoot on June 19th were not grimly professional. They were, at least some of them, visibly thrilled. They had spent years fighting an air war against an enemy that had, in the first 6 months of the Pacific War, regularly killed American pilots in exchanges that were not favorable to the American side. The Hellcats and the VT fuses and the radar-directed interceptions and the training had reversed that equation so completely that on June 19th, the American pilots were running out of ammunition before running out of targets. Several individual pilot after-action reports mentioned this specifically. Pilots had fired all 6 of their guns until empty and were still finding Japanese aircraft that no one else had yet shot down. The destruction of the Marianas-based Japanese air power before the battle began was an operational achievement that has generally received less historical attention than the carrier air battle itself. Between June 11th and 15th, American carrier aircraft systematically attacked the Japanese airfields on Saipan, Tinian, Rota, and Guam, destroying aircraft on the ground and cratering the runways. By the time Ozawa launched his first strike wave on June 19th, the land-based component of Operation Eigo, which had been designed to provide Japan with hundreds of additional aircraft from fixed Marianas airfields, was no longer operationally functional. The aircraft Ozawa believed were waiting at Guam to receive his damaged and fuel-short returning pilots had largely been destroyed in the preceding week of strikes. The Raid 4 aircraft that diverted toward Guam were not flying toward any safety. They were flying toward a kill zone, where American Hellcat fighters were waiting to intercept them as they slowed for their landing approach. The Hellcat's specific technical superiority over the Zero was most decisive in the particular circumstances of the June 19th engagements. The Japanese strike formations were approaching at altitude and had been detected at long range by radar well before they arrived. The FDOs had vectored the Hellcats to intercept positions above and ahead of the Japanese formations. A Hellcat diving on a Zero from above at diving speed, using the energy advantage of superior altitude, was in the most favorable combat position available in 1944 carrier fighter combat. The Zero's greatest tactical advantage, its exceptional turn rate at low speeds, was precisely the capability least available to its pilots when they were the targets of a diving attack from altitude. By the time a Japanese pilot recognized the Hellcats attacking from above and attempted to initiate a defensive break or turn, the outcome of the individual engagement had often already been decided. Admiral Spruance's decision on June 19th to maintain Task Force 58's position west of Saipan, rather than pursue the Japanese fleet westward, was the most consequential individual command decision of the battle from a strategic perspective. Spruance had been ordered to protect the Saipan landings as his primary mission. He believed the Japanese might attempt to send a surface force around the American carriers to attack the invasion beaches, while Mitch's air groups were occupied fighting Ozawa's aircraft. He therefore declined to authorize Mitch to take Task Force 58 on an aggressive westward pursuit of Ozawa's westward retreating fleet. This decision preserved the operational integrity of the Saipan landing force, but allowed Ozawa's surface ships to escape with relatively minimal damage. Critics of the decision argued afterward that a more aggressive pursuit on June 19th might have destroyed most of Ozawa's fleet while it was at its most vulnerable. Defenders of the decision noted that Spruance's assigned primary mission was protecting the Saipan landings, not destroying Ozawa. The full accounting of the battle required separating what happened in the air from what was happening simultaneously below the surface of the Philippine Sea. While the air battle was destroying 480 aircraft over 6 hours on June 19th, the American submarines USS Albacore and USS Kavala were separately and independently sinking the carriers Taiho and Shokaku. The Taiho was Ozawa's flagship, the most advanced fleet carrier Japan had built, sunk by a single torpedo hit that produced an internal aviation fuel vapor explosion 6 hours later. The Shokaku was the most experienced carrier in the Japanese fleet, sunk by 3 torpedoes from the Kavala, while she was actively refueling aircraft on her hangar deck. Both Japanese fleet carriers sank on June 19, 1944. The surviving carrier aircraft that might have returned to them at the end of the day had no carriers left to land on. Of the 35 carrier aircraft that survived the Turkey Shoot that day, some had no carrier left to return to. The pilots who flew for Japan on June 19th were operating at the end of a long sequence of institutional decisions about training and replacement that had been made years before. The decision to prioritize quality over quantity in the pre-war pilot training program had produced the finest carrier aviators of the first phase of the war and had also created the conditions for their irreplaceable loss. The repeated decision not to adequately accelerate pilot training after each major loss, choosing operational tempo over the slower task of rebuilding the pilot pool, had reduced Japanese carrier aviation to what it was in June of 1944, numerically rebuilt but qualitatively diminished. The Turkey Shoot of June 19th was the moment when those accumulated Japanese decisions met an opponent who had made different decisions at every comparable juncture. The full accounting of what June 19th had produced was not complete until the following day. Ozawa still had his surface carriers. He had almost no operational carrier aircraft, but he had the carriers themselves, and he had battleships, and he had the surface force that Japanese doctrine had always envisioned for the decisive battle. On the morning of June 20th, he was still in the Philippine Sea with that surface force. He was waiting for accurate information about what had happened to the aircraft he had launched. What he did not know at that moment was that the aircraft he was waiting to hear from were largely at the bottom of the Philippine Sea. When American search aircraft located his fleet on June 20th, Mitchell requested Spruance's permission to launch a strike. Spruance granted the request. Hit subscribe right now because coming up is what Mitchell's strike on June 20th actually cost. Why Mitchell illuminated the entire fleet that night at the risk of submarine attack. What the Turkey Shoot meant for the Marianas campaign and for the rest of the Pacific War. And why the airfields that American troops captured as a result of June 19th became the most consequential airfields in the history of air warfare. Do not go anywhere. The June 20th American carrier strike against Ozawa's retreating fleet was one of the more logistically dangerous operations American carrier aviation conducted in the Pacific War. Mitchell launched his aircraft at approximately 4:15 in the afternoon, after his search planes confirmed the Japanese fleet's position and bearing. The Japanese fleet was approximately 440 kilometers distant from Task Force 58. American carrier aircraft of 1944 had the range to reach that distance. They did not have sufficient fuel remaining for the full return flight after engaging the enemy fleet. Mitchell launched the strike with full knowledge of this fuel situation. The pilots who flew the strike knew it as well. The strike on June 20th sank the Japanese light carrier Hiyo, damaged 2 other carriers, sank 2 fleet oilers, and shot down approximately 65 Japanese aircraft. The American aircraft then turned back toward Task Force 58, hundreds of kilometers away. The pilots flew back in the dark, navigating by stars and radio signals. Many were running out of fuel as they approached the fleet. The first aircraft began crashing into the sea while still several miles from the carriers. They were ditching into the open ocean because their fuel tanks were empty. Mitchell made the decision to illuminate the fleet. Every ship in Task Force 58 turned on its lights. The carriers lit their flight decks. The destroyers turned on their searchlights. The submarine threat was real. A Japanese submarine that found a lit carrier fleet at night had a straightforward attack. Mitchell accepted that risk to save his pilots. He later stated the reason plainly. These men had done what he asked them to do, and he was not going to let them drown in the dark because of the fuel calculations. The night recovery was still costly despite the fleet illumination. Approximately 80 American aircraft were lost during the return flight and night recovery, either crashed into the sea from fuel exhaustion or wrecked on deck landing. More than 100 pilots and aircrew were rescued from the open water in the days immediately following the battle. The total American aircraft losses for the entire 2-day battle were approximately 123 aircraft and 109 aircrew dead. For those losses, the United States had destroyed approximately 600 Japanese aircraft across the 2 days, sunk 3 fleet and light carriers, and effectively ended Japanese carrier aviation as an offensive operational force. The specific meaning of the phrase Ziggy Neff coined on the Lexington's flight deck is worth examining precisely. A turkey shoot is a contest in which the targets are easy and the outcome is not in doubt. The phrase implies an overwhelming ease. What Neff was describing was not physically easy. The American pilots who flew the June 19th interceptions were simultaneously managing aircraft, navigation, fuel, weapons, and radio communications in an active combat environment. What was easy, relative to any previous carrier battle in the Pacific War, was the outcome. In earlier carrier engagements, Japanese pilots had regularly inflicted serious and costly losses on American air groups. At Coral Sea in May of 1942, the Americans lost the fleet carrier Lexington. At Santa Cruz in October of 1942, they lost the fleet carrier Hornet. The Japanese pilots they had been fighting in those earlier battles were skilled enough to do real and sustained damage. The replacement pilots of June of 1944 were not adequate in the face of the specific defensive system Task Force 58 had assembled. Ozawa's post-war assessment, prepared for Allied interrogators, acknowledged specifically what he had not known going into the battle. He had not understood the full capability of the American radar-directed fighter direction system. He had not understood that his formations would be detected at ranges that allowed interception well before his pilots could even see the American fleet. He had not understood the VT fuse, which made the anti-aircraft environment substantially more lethal than anything Japanese carrier aircraft had flown through before. He had planned Operation Ago based on reasonably accurate intelligence about American carrier numbers, but on assumptions about American anti-aircraft and fighter control capabilities that were substantially behind reality. The assumptions were not unreasonable given what Japanese intelligence had available to it. They were wrong in every critical respect. The Marianas Islands themselves were the strategic reason the battle had been fought. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam were not targets of opportunity in the casual sense. They were the specific objectives that made sustained American air operations against Japan's home islands possible. The strategic logic of capturing the Marianas was geographical. They placed the Japanese home islands within range of the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, the longest-range bomber in the American arsenal. Without the Marianas, B-29s could not reliably reach the Japanese home islands from any existing American base in the Pacific. With the Marianas secured, Japan's industrial cities were within operational reach. June 11th to 15th, 1944, American carrier aircraft destroy Japanese land-based air power in the Marianas. June 15th, American troops land on Saipan. Operation Ago triggered. June 17th, USS Kavala detects and reports Japanese mobile fleet position. June 19th, 8:10 a.m. Taiho hit by USS Albacore. Shokaku hit by USS Kavala. June 19th, 10:19 a.m. First Japanese raid detected at 150 miles by radar. Turkey Shoot begins. June 19th all day. Raid 1, 69 aircraft, most destroyed. Raid 2, 128 aircraft, most destroyed. Raid 3, 47 aircraft, almost all destroyed. Raid 4, 82 aircraft, destroyed at Guam. June 19th, 14:30. Taiho internal vapor explosion, 1,650 dead. June 19th, approximately 1,600. Turkey Shoot ends. 35 Japanese carrier aircraft operational. June 19th evening. Ziggy Neff coins Turkey Shoot on the Lexington flight deck. June 20th. Mitcha launches strike at 4:15 p.m. Hio sunk. Night recovery. Fleet illuminated. 80 American aircraft lost. Saipan declared secure July 9th, 1944. Tinian August 1st. Guam August 10th. November 24th, 1944. First B-29 strike against Tokyo launched from Saipan. 4 factors explain the result of the Turkey Shoot: degradation of Japanese carrier pilot quality, Hellcat superiority in the specific conditions of the battle, the VT fuse, and the radar-directed fighter control system. The first factor, the degradation of Japanese carrier pilot quality, was the product of Japanese training policy combined with the irreplaceable losses of the previous 2 years of carrier warfare. Japan's pre-war training system produced exceptional pilots slowly. The losses at Coral Sea, Midway, the Eastern Solomons, and Santa Cruz had removed those exceptional pilots from the pool and replaced them with adequately trained but combat-inexperienced successors. The gap between the Pearl Harbor aviators and the June 19th strike pilots was not a gap in courage or basic physical capability. It was a gap in accumulated combat experience that distinguishes an aviator who can fight effectively under pressure from one who can only fly competently in controlled conditions. The second factor was the Hellcat's decisive technical superiority in the specific tactical conditions of June 19th. The conditions of the Turkey Shoot maximized the Hellcat's advantages and minimized the Zeroes. The Japanese formations were detected at altitude, vectored on by radar-directed intercept, and hit by Hellcats diving from above. The Zeroes' superior turning ability at low speed was irrelevant when the engagement began with a diving attack from altitude at high speed. The Hellcat's superior diving speed, structural strength, and firepower were the decisive factors in that specific combat geometry. The conditions of the Turkey Shoot were, in the most direct sense, the conditions in which the Hellcat was at its most dangerous. The third critical factor was the VT proximity fuse. Anti-aircraft fire from fleet defense had always been part of carrier battle engagements, but the VT proximity fuse multiplied its operational lethality significantly. Formations of Japanese aircraft that flew through the anti-aircraft zone of Task Force 58 encountered a qualitatively different level of danger than any Japanese pilots had experienced in previous carrier battles. Aircraft that would have survived standard anti-aircraft fire were being destroyed by shells that detonated when they passed nearby, rather than only when they achieved a direct hit. The fourth and arguably most decisive factor was the radar-directed fighter control system. This system gave the American defenders a capability with no equivalent in any previous naval air battle. They had reliable advanced knowledge of the size, altitude, and direction of incoming raids, all of it transmitted to the Hellcat pilots, while the Japanese formations were still far from the fleet. The FDOs on the USS Lexington and other ships managed a defensive battle that the Japanese pilots entering the engagement zone could not understand or counter, because they did not know it was happening until they were in it. The paradox at the center of the great Marianas Turkey Shoot is not subtle, but it is worth stating precisely. The Japanese pilots who attacked Task Force 58 on June 19, 1944, were called a turkey shoot because they were easy to kill. They were easy to kill, not because they were poor pilots in any fundamental sense, but because the combination of their reduced training quality, their inferior aircraft, and their complete lack of awareness of the radar and VT fuse systems they were flying into produced one-sided results. The Japanese pilots who had attacked Pearl Harbor were genuine threats. The men who died over the Philippine Sea in June of 1944 were their institutional successors, flying into conditions that made their individual skill less relevant than the accumulated decisions that had produced them. The Turkey Shoot was not a demonstration of American pilots being better than Japanese pilots. It was a demonstration of what happens when the decisions made by both sides over 2.5 years of war meet in the same airspace on the same afternoon. The Marianas fell in the weeks after the Turkey Shoot. Saipan was declared secure on July 9th. Tinian fell shortly after on August 1st. Guam fell on August 10th, 1944. American engineers began building airfields on all three islands. By November of 1944, the first B-29 superfortresses were operating from Saipan. On November 24, 1944, 111 Boeing B-29 superfortresses launched from Saipan to attack Tokyo. The chain of events that produced that mission runs directly through June 19, 1944, through the 35 Japanese carrier aircraft that came back from the 430 that had left, through Ziggy Neff standing on the Lexington's flight deck and finding the words. It ran through the specific airfield on Tinian, from which the Enola Gay departed in August of 1945. Subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications, because every week we bring you the stories the naval histories reduced to a battle name and a date, without telling you that the pilot who coined the phrase Turkey Shoot was describing not the incompetence of the Japanese pilots who died, but the accumulated result of 2.5 years of decisions about training and technology and replacement that both sides had been making since Pearl Harbor. That Mitchell illuminated his entire fleet at night and accepted the submarine threat because he had decided his pilots who had done what he asked were not going to drown in the dark. Or that the airfields built on the Marianas Islands after the Turkey Shoot made possible the B-29 missions, that made possible everything that followed in the Pacific War. Hit subscribe, then like. So this reaches the people who need to understand what 35 aircraft returning from 430 actually tells you about who was winning and who was losing the Pacific War. Drop a comment below telling us where you are watching from. We will see you in the next one. Mitchell's decision to illuminate the fleet has been examined repeatedly in the historical literature of the Pacific War. It represents a specific type of command decision, one that accepted a known and significant risk to preserve the lives of the people under the commander's authority. The submarine threat was not hypothetical or minor. Japanese submarines were actively operating in the Philippine Sea. A carrier lit up at night was an obvious and easy target. The risk Mitchell accepted by illuminating the fleet was real and substantial. He concluded that the pilots flying back in the dark with empty fuel tanks had fulfilled their part of what the mission required. He was responsible for the outcome on his end of the agreement. He turned on all of the lights across the entire fleet. Most of the surviving pilots made it back or were rescued from the water. The Japanese carrier force that survived the Battle of the Philippine Sea was assessed formally after the fact. Ozawa had entered the battle with 9 carriers of various sizes. He lost 3 of them. He retained 6, including light carriers and the Zuikaku, the only surviving fleet carrier from the original Pearl Harbor attack force. Those 6 remaining carriers had, between all of them, approximately 35 operational aircraft after June 19th and 20th. The American fleet they had failed to stop retained approximately 900 aircraft, most of them undamaged, distributed across 15 carriers. The numerical ratio had been roughly 2-to-1 in American favor before the battle began. After the battle, the Japanese carrier force had been reduced to a surface fleet carrying almost no operational aircraft. The interrogation of Japanese naval officers after the war produced several consistent accounts of what the Japanese command had understood and not understood before the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The consistent theme across those accounts is that the Japanese command had known about some American advantages and had significantly underestimated others. They knew the Hellcat was a substantially improved aircraft over the Wildcat. They did not know that the specific combination of Hellcat performance, VT fuse lethality, and radar-directed fighter control had created a defensive system qualitatively different from anything they had previously faced. The VT fuse in particular appears repeatedly in the post-war accounts as an operational surprise. Japanese officers described the anti-aircraft fire over Task Force 58 as qualitatively and noticeably different from what Japanese carrier pilots had encountered in any previous carrier battle. They were right about that. It was qualitatively different. The ground campaign for the Marianas continued after June 19th. American ground forces fought for Saipan through late June and into July against Japanese garrison defenders who were following Tojo's explicit instruction that the Marianas had to be held at all costs. Saipan fell on July 9th. The Japanese garrison commander, his options entirely exhausted, led a final mass infantry attack rather than accept surrender. The civilian population of Saipan, informed that American capture meant torture and death, was led to the northern cliffs. Thousands jumped. American troops and ships tried to stop them and could not. The fall of Saipan directly contributed to the fall of Tojo's government in Tokyo. Tinian was secured August 1st. Guam fell on August 10th. The construction engineers were already surveying the airfield sites before the fighting on each island had fully stopped. The B-29 Superfortress had been developed at enormous financial cost and with enormous industrial priority by the American war production system. It was the longest-range strategic bomber in the American arsenal, designed specifically to reach targets that no previous bomber could approach. The problem was geography. Japan's industrial and military centers were concentrated on the home islands. From existing American bases in the Pacific, including those in China, the B-29's range was insufficient for reliable strategic bombing campaigns. The Marianas changed this. Saipan is approximately 2,400 kilometers from central Tokyo. The B-29's maximum combat radius was approximately 6,000 kilometers. The math worked. The engineers who designed the B-29 and the strategic planners who developed the Marianas campaign had understood this geographic relationship before the campaign began. Capturing the Marianas was, from the very beginning of its planning, a strategic bombing infrastructure project at its core. The legacy of the Turkey Shoot was understood in different ways by different participants. For the American pilots who flew it, June 19th was the day they finally had every relevant advantage simultaneously: the best fighter, the best technology, the best advance information, and the least capable enemy they had faced. For the Japanese pilots who survived it, June 19th was the day they understood that the war they were fighting had changed in ways their commanders had not fully told them. For the historians who have written about it since, it is the clearest single-day demonstration of what accumulated American investment in technology and training had produced, measured against accumulated Japanese attrition. The phrase Ziggy Neff coined contains all of those different meanings simultaneously. It is simultaneously the most accurate description of the result and the least accurate description of what produced that result.